The sea had already crossed the line between the living and the dead. A gravepost floated past Enno's boots. Salt wind drove wet sand against his face, and the sea hissed through the open graves below the terp. He had not set foot on Südfall in 12 years, yet the island met him with the same question it had thrown after him then: why had he poisoned the bell? He climbed the muddy rise toward the church mound with his coat tied tight and his tool chest bumping his knee. The marsh smelled of brine, rotting reeds, and fresh earth torn from old burial ground. 2 boys stood beside a leaning fence and watched him without greeting. One lifted his chin toward the church tower, where no bell hung now, only a black frame clawing at the sky. Enno knew what they saw. Not a craftsman, not a son returned. They saw the man whose bell had split on the night of the winter flood. When the northwater broke over the flats, the sexton had pulled the rope until his hands bled. The bell had answered with one thin cry, then cracked from lip to crown. By the time riders reached the outer homes, the tide had taken 6 people and half the sheep. He had fled before dawn. Shame moved faster than any horse. Now the sea had called him back. 3 days earlier, a letter found him in Husum, written in a stiff old hand. The graves are opening. The dike at Ponchalig sinks each tide. Come if any fear of God still works in you. It bore no name, only a smear of peat on the fold. At the church door, Pastor Levin blocked his path. The pastor's beard was white now, but his shoulders still held like oak beams. Rain ticked on the stones around them. You chose a poor hour to return, Levin said. Behind him, voices rose inside the church. Enno stepped past the pastor's shoulder and saw why. Water shone on the flagstones. Through the open west door, people stared toward the burial ground, where another row of graves had slumped and broken. A child's small coffin, washed pale by old years underground, lay tilted in the mud. Then the church floor trembled under Enno's soles. Outside, from the seaward side, came a sound like cloth tearing across the world. Men ran for the dike. Women gathered children and lanterns. Pastor Levin seized Enno's arm at last. If the outer wall goes before night, he said, this Hallig will need a bell again. Not for worship, for warning. If you know how to mend what you broke, speak now. Enno looked at the empty tower, at the people who would rather trust wind than his hands, and at the sea lifting itself beyond the marsh grass. He opened his mouth, but an old woman by the font spoke before him. Not mended, she said. Made true. She wore a black shawl pinned under her chin, and marsh mud clung to the hem of her skirt. Her eyes rested on Enno as if she had expected him before the letter was written. Come to my house when the tide turns, she said. If he wants the island to hear, he must first let the marsh hear him. When the graves broke open, the old woman lived in a salt house half sunk into the lee side of a dwelling mound. Turf smoke drifted from the chimney and mixed with the smell of drying fish. Enno ducked under the lintel and found her alone, setting a kettle over low peat fire as if no storm pressed at the walls. Before the fire could be lit, old anger had to be named in public. My name is Wiebke Jansen, she said. You buried my husband after the flood. You did not stay for the prayers. Enno removed his cap. I had no right to stand among them. She nodded once, as though he had finally said something plain. On the table lay 3 things: a bell clapper wrapped in linen, a handful of green pale bronze scraps, and a child's silver baptism spoon blackened with age. The marsh sends back what men try to hide, Wiebke said. She unwrapped the clapper. A crack ran across its iron eye. This washed from the church bank yesterday. The sea has begun turning pockets inside out. That is why I wrote. Enno touched the bronze pieces. They were from his old bell. He knew the grain of the metal the way a shepherd knows a scar on his own hand. He had stretched the bronze with sifted hearth ash to save coin and win a contract beyond his worth. The mixture had poured smooth. The lie had hidden inside shine and sound until the winter flood struck it open. Wiebke poured tea into thick cups. The room held no softness, yet the warmth stung his cold fingers and dragged memory into him. He remembered the night after the flood, when men carried bodies wrapped in sailcloth. He remembered seeing Wiebke kneel beside one bundle and press her forehead against it without a sound. Some grief makes no room for shouting. Why call me back? He asked. She placed the spoon beside the bronze. Because Südfall cannot buy a bell from the mainland before the next spring tide. Because a false bell brought death, and only a true one may call against it. Old people said this when I was a child. A warning bell for drowning land must be cast from confessed guilt and metal offered with free hands. Not tax metal, not seized metal, gift metal. Enno almost laughed. not from mockery but from weariness. You ask for a church tale when water is eating the dike. Wiebke leaned forward. No, I ask for a human thing. A man speaks the wrong he has done. His neighbors choose whether they will answer him. If they do, the bell carries all their hands, not one man's pride. That is why it calls farther. Outside, someone pounded on the shutter and shouted that the western sheep meadow had gone under. Wiebke did not move. She kept her eyes on Enno until he looked down. Bridge and ritual met there in silence. It was not old words that shook him. It was the spoon. Some mother had once fed broth to a child with that spoon, wiped it clean, and saved it through winters. To lay such a thing on a table for melting meant trust cut loose from need. By dusk, Pastor Levin gathered the islanders in the church. Wet cloaks steamed in the close air. Lantern light slid over faces Enno knew by age more than name. Boys had become fathers. Girls whose braids once flew across the marsh now held grandchildren against their skirts. Levin spoke first. He named the danger. The outer dike had dropped 2 hands in 1 week. The burial ground was slipping. Another hard tide could cross the Hallig at night. Then he stepped aside. Enno stood before them with the bronze scraps in both palms. He did not dress his words. He told them he had cheated the metal. He told them greed had made him deaf. He told them 6 people had paid for coin he never kept, because he had thrown most of it away on the road in disgust before dawn. When he finished, rain tapped the church windows like small thrown seeds. No one spoke for several breaths. Then a fisherman named Hauke spat on the floor near Enno's boot. My sister died with her newborn that night, he said. If the sea takes you first, I will call it fair. Others muttered agreement. One woman began to weep from old anger, not fresh fear. Enno let it strike him. He had carried words against himself for years. Hearing them aloud hurt less than hearing the sea outside. Wiebke rose from the back pew and held up the baptism spoon. I give this, she said. My daughter used it before the fever took her. I give it because I want the next child to wake when the bell calls. The room shifted. A cooper set down his late wife's bronze thimble. A sailor laid a bent brass compass lid in the collection basket. Pastor Levin unclasped 2 cracked candlesticks from the altar chest. Not all stepped forward, but enough did. When Hauke's turn came, he stood rigid for so long that Enno thought he would leave. At last he took off the heavy ring from his dead father's sea chest key and dropped it into the basket without looking at Enno. If this fails, Hauke said, you stand with me on the dike when the water comes. I will, Enno answered. The widow at the salt house they built the furnace on the highest terp, in the lee of the church and above the lamb pens. Men dragged brick from collapsed bake ovens. Women brought peat, driftwood, and sacks of charcoal saved for winter ironwork. Children carried water in pails that knocked against their knees. No one called the work hopeful, yet no one left it undone. Their keepsakes gave up their old shapes and entered the same fire. Enno marked a casting pit in the sodden ground and set the mold forms with hands that had not touched sacred work in years. He moved without wasted motion. Shame had not stolen his craft. It had only left it idle. Still, each tool he lifted seemed to ask whether skill could weigh against a grave. At noon, Wiebke came with a cloth bundle. Inside lay a bronze bridal crown, small as 2 joined hands, dark from long storage. Enno stared. You said no more. You have given enough. It was my mother's, she said. She wore it when the Hallig still held 4 full mounds. Now 2 are gone. Metal kept in a chest cannot call anyone home. That was the second bridge the island laid before him. Not old custom for display, but a daughter loosening the last bright thing from her family line because water had come too close to children's beds. Enno took the crown with both hands, as careful as if he held bone. By evening, the mold stood ready, packed with loam and horse dung, dried by shielded heat. Enno scratched 1 line into the wax form before the final closing. No ornament, no proud maker's mark, only a narrow band of reeds bent by wind. Südfall needed no flourish. It needed a voice that would not break. Pastor Levin asked if he wanted the church prayers said over the mold. Enno shook his head. Let the people stand, he said. That is enough. When darkness came, they fed the furnace. Fire climbed and settled into its work. Bell metal does not melt under pleading. It answers only heat, air, and patience. Enno watched color rise inside the crucible from dull red to harsh yellow. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold wind. Salt from the air dried on his lips. One by one, he added the offerings. The spoon vanished first, then thimbles, candlesticks, hinges, buckles, compass brass, and the bridal crown. Each piece struck the melt with a brief bright flash and then was gone. The island stood around the fire in a ring, faces lit from below, each person watching some private memory disappear into common metal. Hauke came last. He had brought more than the key ring. In his fist lay a small bell from a sheep harness, green and rough with age. "My sister tied this on her lead ewe," he said. "I kept it after the flood because it still smelled of lanolin. Take it now. I am tired of listening for a dead animal in my sleep." He dropped it in. The sound it made was no more than a click. Yet Enno felt the air change around the furnace. Grief shared aloud takes a little of its own weight with it. Near midnight, the wind turned hard northwest. The church vane whined. Beyond the dark, the sea gave a deep rolling blow against the outer bank. Men on watch came running to say the water had reached the willow markers early. Enno checked the melt. Good metal moves with thick bright skin and no dark clots. He saw one gray streak floating near the edge and froze. Ash. A pinch of furnace ash had dropped from the draft mouth. For one old sick instant, his body remembered concealment. Skim it aside. Pour fast. Say nothing. Instead, he lifted the ladle out and struck it on the rim. "Stop the draft," he called. The furnace roared down under Hauke's hand at the bellows. Faces turned toward Enno. He pointed at the gray streak where all could see. "There is impurity in the melt. If I pour now, I risk another crack. We must clean and raise heat again. That costs an hour, perhaps more." A groan moved through the ring. Out at the dike, an hour might mean the difference between seep and break. Pastor Levin looked toward the sea. Wiebke looked only at Enno. "Then do it clean," she said. No one argued after that. They skimmed, reheated, and fed the furnace again while the wind battered. The hill. Enno's hands shook once, then steadied. The choice cut him open and stitched him at the same time. He had spoken before danger forced confession from him. For the first time in years, he trusted his own mouth. When the metal was ready, he gave the signal. 4 men lifted the crucible with iron yokes. Fire painted their sleeves orange. Enno led them to the mold pit. All around, the island held its breath. They poured. Bronze ran down the channel in a white-gold stream, fierce and smooth. The mold drank it without a stutter. Steam burst from the packed earth and rushed over their faces, carrying the bitter smell of hot loam and singed straw. Enno listened not with ears alone but with his wrists, his teeth, his whole skin, for the wrong note of trapped air or broken core. None came. Then the sea horn sounded from the dike. 3 blasts. Water over the outer wall. Fire in the sheep meadow. They could not break the mold at once. Fresh cast bronze must set before it can bear hammer or rope. So the island turned from fire to water. Lanterns swung across the night as people ran downslope with spades, wicker hurdles, and sacks of clay. Enno went with them because Hauke had named the price, and because a bell still sleeping in its mold could save no one. When the rope moved, the island heard more than bronze answer back. The outer dike had slumped where the marsh rats had tunneled through the old clay. Black water lipped over the breach and spread cold across the sheep meadow. Each wave brought weeds, foam, and the sour smell of disturbed mud. Men thrust hurdles into the gap while women and older boys packed clay against them. Smaller children hauled turf in aprons. No hand stayed empty. The sea struck again. Hauke lost his footing and went to one knee in the wash. Enno caught his collar and dragged him back before the next push. Neither man spoke. They jammed another hurdle into place and leaned their weight together against it until others could brace it with sacks. Near dawn, the first force of the tide eased. Not victory, only delay. Water still sheeted over the lower flats, and the graves below the church mound had vanished under a dull gray skin. Sheep huddled on every rise they could find. One lamb cried until a girl tucked it inside her coat. Enno climbed the terp with mud to his thighs. The mold lay under tarred cloth and banked sand, cooling in its own time while the world rushed around it. He knelt and laid one hand against the earth. Warmth pulsed there, steady as a heartbeat. Wiebke stood beside him with 2 crusts of black bread and a slice of hard cheese. "Eat," she said. He obeyed. Salt from the cheese woke his empty stomach like pain. Around them, exhausted people sat where they dropped, heads bowed over steaming mugs. Pastor Levin moved from group to group with a hand on shoulders, no grand speech, only presence. "If the bell lives," Enno said, "it may still not ring far enough in storm wind." Wiebke tore her bread in half. "Then it will ring as far as truth can carry. That is more than a false one ever did." By midday they opened the mold. Hammer blows knocked away packed earth and charred loam. The bronze emerged slowly, first the shoulder, then the curve, then the mouth. Mud streaked the new metal. Steam rose from it in pale threads. Enno searched for hairline marks, cold shuts, casting seams gone wrong. There were none. A sound moved through the gathered people, not cheer, not yet. It was the breath a room takes when a fever breaks but the patient still lies weak. They hoisted the bell with block and tackle lashed to the church frame. Every rope creaked. Hauke climbed the beam first to set the top pin. Enno followed to fix the yoke. Wind tugged at their coats and drove spray all the way from the flooded flats. Below them, the island looked smaller than memory, a handful of green mounds and sod roofs under one wide iron sky. "Why did you come back?" Hauke asked without turning. Enno set the final wedge. "Because your dead had more courage than I did. They stayed." Hauke gave one short nod. It was not pardon, it was room to continue. Before sunset, they hung the clapper. The bronze still held furnace heat under its skin. Enno wrapped his hand around the rope and looked down at the people below. Wiebke stood near the front, shawl whipping. Pastor Levin held his cap against his chest. The children watched with open mouths, as children do when adults around them decide whether to hope. From the far bank came a shout. Another surge was building. The line of sea on the horizon had sharpened and darkened. "Ring," Hauke said. Enno pulled. The first strike rolled out low and full, not sharp like the old bell, not thin, not strained. It crossed the marsh in one broad wave of sound that seemed to gather the wind instead of fighting it. Birds rose from the flooded flats. Men at the dike lifted their heads. The sheep bunched and moved upslope. He rang again, and again. Each note traveled over water, over graves, over roofs shining with spray. The sound did not promise safety. It gave command. Wake. Lift. Climb. Hold. The second tide hit in the dark. Because the bell had spoken early, every house had emptied its lower rooms. Children and bedding reached the highest mounds. Boats were tied where hands could find them. The breach widened, then held against the braced hurdles until the worst of the water passed. By dawn, Südfall still stood. When morning light spread through thin cloud, the sea had laid driftwood, eelgrass, and one broken coffin board across the meadow. It had also left the church mound untouched. The new bell swung damp and brown above the people, quiet now, with gulls crossing behind it. Enno did not ask what place remained for him on the island. He went to the burial ground with shovel and timber and began setting the fallen markers upright. After a while, Hauke came beside him. Then two boys. Then Pastor Levin. By noon, half the Hallig worked among the graves while the bell watched over them in silence.